The future of theological education will depend upon the voices it's willing to elevate and embody. There are certain aspects of culture, society, church, mission, the mission of the church, that theological education needs to begin to elevate those voices into their courses, programs, but also embody them.
Welcome to the Lausanne Movement Podcast, where we have a passion to accelerate global mission together. If you like today's episode, won't you take a moment to rate and review our podcast and subscribe? That way you won't miss a thing. And now, for today's interview. Well, Dr. Michael Ortiz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me with you. It's an honor to be with you. Look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, I'm personally really excited about what might come through in our conversation and our time together. But to begin, Michael, you grew up in New York City to Cuban immigrants, and you then had a very successful law career in Florida. And so as I was researching you and getting to know a bit about your history, that really stood out to me. You know, transitioning from a career in law to theological education is quite a leap. I know that people have done it in the past. We've had some theologians who were law professors and involved in law and throughout church history. But what motivated you to make this major shift in your life?
Wow, man, that's a huge question, Jason. It could take hours to describe all that process. But I became a lawyer. We moved back to Sarasota, Florida, where we were from after law school. My wife and I did. And my wife is my high school sweetheart. We dated 6 years, they got married, went to law school.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Married now 38 years. And I'm getting that number right. I know I am. So the Lord has been really gracious to us in our marriage, and He has been faithful to keep us in love and together and just pursuing Christ together in our relationship. But going back to your question, so I graduated law school and started practicing law and started having children, and then realized, well, you know what? We probably need to start attending a church for the sake of the young little ones that we have now. And they need some kind of moral compass in life that maybe we can't give them. So let's go to church. Long story short, I met this interim pastor. He asked me to be part of a small group. We started a men's, well, it was a men's and then a couple small group. In the small group, there were 12 people in the group, 7 of which were non-believers, and I was one of them. And my wife was a non-believer. And over time, over the course of a summer, this interim pastor led each and every single one of us to Christ. I was the last one, being the lawyer, I needed to have all the evidence lined up and perfectly squared away. So we all came to Christ, and we ended up starting a church in Sarasota. From there, as that started to really develop and my love for the Lord grew, all of a sudden I had this deep sense that I needed to know the Word of God, and started to outline the New Testament on my own and thinking about the Word and reflecting on it. And one thing led to another, and ended up studying at Dallas Seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary. And over time, the Lord continued to show me that He wanted me to continue to practice as a way to support my family, support missions, support all the work that we were doing. But over time, it evolved to the point where it was that moment where the law thing was great for the time it was, and I actually enjoyed practicing law. I didn't, it wasn't something I didn't like. But then after a while, I just realized, okay, let's just really move into this other portion of life that the Lord has in front of me. And so I share it with people, Jason. I just feel so honored, so blessed that the Lord has given me the opportunity to have 2 full careers and be able to move into 2 different spaces in life. So it was a journey. It took a while, but here we are. And I'm just thankful for what the Lord's done and where He has us at right now. So.
Wow. Michael, I really appreciate testimonies like your own. I mean, we're talking about mission at Lausanne as a missions organization. But for me, my foundations are the local church. And for me to hear stories of how local church brings transformation in the lives of people, it's super encouraging. And for those church pastors who are listening, you never know what small group conversation will transform a life and have massive mission impact.
And that's a great point, Jason, because this interim pastor, he had no idea what was going to happen. And all of a sudden, he's got 12 people sitting around his living room table and hanging out and talking about the book of John. And after a while, the seven that were not believers, we all come to Christ. And then we start a church. He started a church with us in Sarasota, Florida. And from there, that church has led hundreds and hundreds of people to Christ over the years. And the church is still going now 30 years later. So
Beautiful. Well, shout out to your pastor who was able to be faithful in that way. So let's shift. Let's talk about theological education. I'm so aware that our context plays a huge role in how we interpret theology or understand the word of God in our own context. How do you feel your upbringing in New York City and your legal background has shaped your approach to theological education?
yeah, I think, my upbringing in New York City, I lived in Manhattan, grew up around a wide variety of people all around us. We lived in an apartment complex where that apartment complex had all sorts of people from different parts of the world there. And then even with my law practice, I had a wide variety of clients that I would try to help over time. And so what I think my upbringing in New York City and then even my legal practice, what I have found, one of the things that I have found is that it's given me a level of comfortability in relating to people from different
Mm,
settings, different cultures, being open to listen to people, especially as an attorney. If you're going to really advance your client's cases well, you need to understand really what's going on below the surface, right? You can't just argue a case based upon what you might hear at first blush. And so for me, when I look at my work now, even in teaching students, in traveling and interacting with people from different parts of the world, in interacting with theological education leaders and training programs, I tend to listen, I think, fairly well because of my background, and then also be able to ask some questions that sort of help me to reflect a little further on what might be going on. So I'm thankful for that background because that has, I think, shaped me in that sense. And of course, the legal training also as well also develops a certain skill set in terms of reflection and analytical thinking and communication and so on that is has been helpful, I think, is in my work that the Lord has now led me into.
I mean, what I'm really hearing from you is that your context has really shaped your ability to contextualize and to listen to a wide group of people, which, in my experience, I mean, I went to a fantastic theological seminary, but a large part of the things that we studied and the people that we studied from, the textbooks that we learned from, and the systematic books that we worked through, most of those were written by people in the West, people in the States mostly. And that has really shaped a large part of, I've inherited a large part of theology through that lens. And so I would love to hear from you the concept of global voices being heard in theological education. What are some voices that you feel that we need to include in our theological education?
I've recently been sharing a statement that is something like this, Jason, and that is to say that the future of theological education will depend upon the voices it's willing to elevate and embody. And I
Wow.
use those two words, those two verbs very
Hmm.
intentionally because what I'm trying to say is that there are certain aspects of culture, society, church, mission, the mission of the church, that theological education needs to begin to elevate those voices into their courses, programs, but also embody them. So it's not just to elevate them, but embody them, meaning that they actually become part of the ethos or part of the culture within training programs and institutions. So it's not just enough to elevate them, but how do you actually begin to live them out, right? And make them part of your culture. So some of those voices of late that I've seen that we really need to be thinking about more carefully includes women. What is the role of women in not only in the church, but in mission and in training and education? And how do we begin to further include them and embody them within the culture of our training programs? The other area has to do with orality. Most of the world now learns in oral ways. And so, how do we begin to elevate and further embody oral learning and teaching within our training programs? We have next generation youth leaders. As I look at the world today and I think about what the future of the church and missions looks like, how is it that we are including the voices of younger people that need to be heard and need to be embodied within training and institution programs. How about diaspora and refugee peoples? How about theological education in conflicted contexts? There are parts of the world right now that are really struggling due to war, other crises that might be taking place. How do we continue to train our people and keep the church strengthened for mission in the midst of those contexts? And so these are some of the topics that as I travel and as I meet with people from different settings and I try to do what I said earlier, just try to listen and reflect on what's really happening. These are some of the voices. There are many others that need to be sort of included within our not just our institutions. I know we want to talk about formal theological education, but I'm also talking about some of the even non-formal church-based training programs. How are they doing this? Because I use the phrase the church strengthened for mission through theological education. And I was in Liberia recently, and I was teaching a number of people there in a one-day seminar, and I asked the question, how is it that theological education is going to shape the Liberian story? And how is it that these are all theological educators, both at the formal and non-formal level? And I was kind of pressing into them a little bit about that question. Why are you doing what you're doing? What is kind of the long-term impact you want to have? What are some of the voices that need to be included within your training programs? These are questions that I'm asking as I interact with people nowadays, and I try to couch it in a way where it becomes their story, right? I mean, how is it that training is going to shape your church strength of her mission, your culture, society, and so on? I think there's a big part that theological education can play in that role. And that's what kind of gets me excited about it.
I'd be interested to hear from you how we can move beyond just talking about these things and even maybe beyond tokenism, because I feel like in some
Yeah.
element there's this temptation to put that woman on stage so that therefore we can tick the box and say, oh, we had a woman on stage. And I feel like there's a huge danger in that process. What practical ways, maybe it's a story or maybe it's an example that you can tell, how can theological institutions, how can churches move beyond just that of tokenism to actually living this out?
That's why I use that other verb. It's not just to elevate them, right? It's not just to put them on a stage, on a platform, and let them speak or so on, but it's about how do we embody these things, these areas, these voices within our training programs, and even within the church. So one of the things that I have seen, for instance, is we were just in Africa a few weeks back in April, actually, and there was a conference held, and the conference was about diversity in theological education. And the diversity question really was about the role of women and the role of women in education and in training. And what I found was that there were stories that were shared. One story was about a woman who had been invited into a lower level leadership role within an institution in Africa. And when she was invited into that role, she was the only woman that had any leadership responsibility at the institution, and it was awfully difficult. And she shared, I hate to say this, but she even shared how there were times where she felt like there was some misconduct taking place and overtures to her that were not appropriate. But over time, she ended up continued, she persisted. She had a friend or two within the institution that encouraged her. She had family, she had church that were encouraging her. And as she continued over time, she ended up becoming the academic dean of the school and has now has people that are calling her their supervisor, and they are happy to do so, right? And so that's a story. And if you, I mean, I'm not doing the story justice, Jason, because if you hear the way she describes it and the depth to which she had to deal with emotional responses or reactions to continue to pursue what she felt God was calling her to do was really rather significant. But the point is that in this example, you had someone who was willing to persist through this. She had the right people around her to encourage her, to be with her, to walk with her, to believe in her. And I think that's what we need to be doing more. I think we need to be walking, identifying those that we know need to have some other responsibilities. There's more that they can do for the church and for the mission of the church. And how do we come alongside of those people, encourage them, pray for them, and let them know that they're not alone? Because as we begin to think about some of these voices that we want to elevate and embody today within education and within the church, it can be a process that unless we are coming alongside of them, many people might just want to bail out and not pursue that. So I think that's an important part of what I see us doing moving ahead.
So what I hear you saying is that support is vital.
Yeah.
So it's not just about platforming, but it's about Monday through to Friday, the support that is needed in these areas. I would love to shift gears just a little bit. Earlier in our conversation, you mentioned the impact of theological institutions on the local church and the training of leaders within these spaces actually has a massive impact on the local spaces. So, for instance, I know that I preach what I know, right? And what I've been taught. So, I take to my people and my community the resources that have been offered to me and the training that has been offered to me. How can we better prepare students with sound theological frameworks for the future of the church? As we're speaking about the future of global mission, the future of the global church, and the trajectory we're on, what are some ways that we can prepare students so that they can bring and speak meaningfully into these spaces?
I think it often begins by who is teaching to begin with. Someone told me a while ago, people will write what they read and people will teach how they were taught, right? And I think a lot of that is true. And so, one of the things I try to think about, and when I interact with institutions, I try to understand who their faculty are, what are they doing, how are they teaching, what are some of the things they're involved in outside of the institution, what are some of their passion areas, what do they get excited about. All of those things begin to come across when you're teaching in a classroom and helping to develop future leaders for the church. So I think one of the areas is simply just who is teaching, who are the professors, and how are they communicating something that is really transformational in the personal lives of their students. Because you can give them all the head knowledge you want to, and there's we can do all the content dumping that we want, but if content is not followed with character development, then I'm not sure what good it is over the long term. So that's one aspect. I think also, Jason, I think there's a growing hunger for a sense of what is truth. And we have gone from an era of modernity to post modernity. And now people are asking the question, well, just like modernity did not answer all of our questions, is post modernity not answering all of our questions now either? And people are beginning to want to know, I want to know what is true. And I think we need to return back to the word of God and the scriptures and begin to hone in on teaching truth out of the word of God, because I think that is what is going to begin to really transform the lives of our students, the lives of our churches, keep people focused on mission. I just did a seminar the other day and I talked about the whole mission of God and how the Missio Dei, the mission of God, is reflected in the whole of the scriptures, the whole of the word of God from beginning to end, his whole redemptive plan. I'm not sure if enough people really understand that and grasp even that. Because I tell people, if you understand the mission of God from a biblical, even historical standpoint, how can you sit there and do nothing? The mission of God must call us to respond. And I believe that that is truth, biblical truth, that training programs today need to hone in on and begin to communicate to younger people, because I think younger people are looking for some of that. I see the growth in the Anglican church, for instance, the Anglican stream of Christianity. And I ask the question, why is that happening? I think part of the reason why it's happening is because it's grounded on some historical basis and it gives a kind of a foundation that people can stand on, because post-modernity has really not responded to all of the questions we've had. And so I think that having good models, good teachers, but also just teaching truth out of the word of God, especially the missional purpose of God.
That's so rich. As you were speaking, I was just reminded of Desmond Henry, who is now the catalyst for proclamation evangelism within the Lausanne network. He was part of the pastoral team at my church, and then he became my lecturer at Bible college. And the whole semester, all he spoke about was the mission of God throughout the scriptures. And I remember almost every time he taught, he went back to Genesis chapter 12, the call of Abraham, and it was like he shared the same lecture again and again. And at the time, I didn't get it, but he was doing exactly what you were describing as you were speaking earlier. And I can't tell you how many times from stage or when I'm preaching or when I'm engaging with people one on one that I've gone back to those lessons that he taught me. And often it's when I go off script, it's just like, guys, you got to catch the vision of God for your life and for the world. And so I truly appreciate what you've just said, and it's made me appreciate there's way more than I already do.
Yeah, yeah. If I could, Jason, let me just do 2 things. One is I've got a quote here from Lausanne, Cape Town, 2010, and here's what it says: "The mission of the church on earth is to serve the mission of God, and the mission of theological education is to strengthen and accompany the mission of the church."
Beautiful.
And that is Lausanne. That is what I believe in. When I talk about theological education, I tell people I'd like for you to begin to think about locating theological education, placing it within a missional ecclesial framework. And it is an instrument. Theological education and training is an instrument of God. It is a tool that he has selected to use to strengthen the church for mission. And unless, we talk about renewal in theological education, talk about rebranding, refreshing, whatever. And I'm starting to talk about recalibrating the theological education. And what I mean by that is to, in some respects, it has sort of drifted off course and it has gone after other settings, other course headings, and I want to see how we can recalibrate it so it's back on its true intended course, and that is to be that instrument of God for the mission of God. I think as I share and as I speak to people about this, there's some receptivity to this, but I think we still have a long way to go. And I think what Lausanne is doing is vital for us to continue to communicate that kind of message.
And to add to what you're saying, I think when I went to Bible college seminary, the goal was, I mean, I was in the local church, I was being trained to be a pastor, but the seminary experience for me largely had to do with systematic theology, had to do with learning about God. And when people said, "What do you do at Bible college or seminary?" I would say, "Oh, I'm learning about God, it's the study of God." And it in no way was it ever, at least, look, students don't always pick up on things that they should be picking up on, right? So I'll put some onus on myself. But not once did I frame in the sense of the mission of God. Like I'm being trained to take like the mission of God into my context. And I think that's that powerful reframe for theological institutions and for training, non-formal training as well. I think that's a really helpful reframe that we should emphasize more regularly.
I think so, and if you start to think about that and, bring it down to more practical terms, so imagine, like you just mentioned being a student, imagine how students might think about their training. Why are they in a classroom? Why are they in an institution? Why are they taking time to study? What is their core purpose? If they understood that what they're doing is they're receiving an instrument of God, a tool that God can use in their lives to shape them to come alongside of God and carry out his mission. I talk about God's mission through missions. We understand that God has a central mission, a biblical narrative that we all understand, that we want to understand more, but that mission then ought to drive us to missions and ought to drive us to do something in response. So imagine if students had that kind of framework. Imagine if institutions, as they look for funding and resources to maintain their programs, if they were talking about their institutions as part of the mission of God, that they are there to exist to serve the mission of God. Imagine if assessment, and how do we know that we're doing good quality training if assessment was centered around the mission of God. These are things that I'm beginning to think about, Jason. How do we begin to foster those kind of environments within training and education today?
So, a question. You quoted the Lausanne 2010 commitment, Cape Town commitment. How can we bridge the gap between theological education and the church? Because in many regards, there is a gap, and for me, it's on many levels. You know, we have students going through the theological education process. In some cases, in my country, they leave atheists because of the colleges they go to or the universities they go to. But in many cases, they're being educated and their heads are being filled with knowledge, but there isn't an experience on the ground. Like there's no connection to the local church. So there's that one level. But on the other sense, you have churches who are starting to train up their own pastors because they don't trust the theological institutions, right? And so you have a non-formal and a formal sector that aren't talking to each other, aren't connecting with each other. So let me frame it like that. How do we bridge the gap between theological institutions and the church?
I say sometimes that there are many institutions around the world, and I say that intentionally, meaning that it's not just a majority world or global South issue. Okay. It is in the West as well. So there are many institutions that I say are turning inward to protect and survive. Okay. Rather than turning outward to prepare and serve. They're turning more inward to protect and survive than to turning outward to prepare and serve. And it's not a matter of finances, I don't think, Jason, because there are schools in the West that have a lot of resources and they're not doing all that well. Some are, and some are doing good, but many are not. And I interact with my friends in the global South settings and majority world settings and so on, and they are eager to have more funding and resources. And I get it. Yeah, it's useful to have that, but it's not just about that. It's about having a posture within your training institution program that is more outward facing than inward facing. And part of that is the church, and it is being able to be connected to the church. Now, what I've learned as I've traveled and interacted with many is that we need to use different language and different terminology, different phrasing of things to maybe inspire institutions to think about these things differently. So, what I say nowadays is I say theological education is most alive. It has the most vibrancy, the most life in it when it is addressing current realities and anticipating future challenges of the church. And if we don't do that, theological education and institutions, no matter how much they have in resources and support, they're not going to be relevant. And that's what we're talking about. So, how is it that they are relevant to the current issues that are going on? But also, theological education historically has been more reactive than proactive. And church might be moving in this direction and facing these issues, and theological education all of a sudden trying to catch up. But by the time they catch up, it's 5 years down the road. I talk about pew level realities. What are some of the pew level realities that theological education needs to be in tune with? And I think that's where the non formal sectors of training can be really helpful. And that's where I talk about how can we begin to flatten the differences between the formal and non formal. Not that one's going to replace the other, but how can we reinforce one another over time? And so it's not about replacement. People are concerned about that. I'm not talking about replacement, I'm talking about reinforcing because the formal spaces, the institutions, they have a lot they could learn from our non-formal training leaders, most of which, as you've alluded to, are church-based programs. One of the concerns, however, that I do have about church-based training programs is that as the institutions turn more inward to protect and survive, churches are turning more inward themselves, preparing their own training programs because they have exigent needs. They have current immediate needs, and they can't wait for a seminary to develop something in 6 months. Because the seminary won't do that. So those are complexities, issues that I see that we need to continue to wrestle with. And I think Lasan has a space for that. I think the organization that I lead, I said, has a space to do that. You know, for us to really serve the church well and strengthen her for mission over the long term, I think we need to be looking at how do we bring all these different sectors of training together because it's not one institution, it's not one training program, it's not one teacher. There's not one sector that's going to be able to tackle the needs of the church today and into the future. So we need to be looking at this in a very collaborative posture environment. And I think we're making some progress in that direction, but I know we have a long way to go too.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to chat to you about iSet, and I think we'll get there because what you guys are doing is phenomenal. But before we dive too quickly into that space, I would love to hear a story or an example where you've seen healthy collaboration between a theological institution and the local church. Do you have any good examples?
There are several examples. I'll mention one that I know about in Colombia and in Latin America, where there has been a real intentional effort to bring together and create sort of a local hub of institutions, churches, and non formal training programs. And they have actually been meeting over the course of the last year and a half to 2 years. And they are looking at what are the needs of the church. How is it that the more non-formal training programs are meeting some of those needs? And then the seminaries and Bible colleges are coming in to fill in some of the gaps. And so what they're doing is they're having weekend workshops, maybe week-long seminars and conferences that include all of these different aspects of local church life. Let's call it that, local church life, meaning not just the church itself, but just training programs and institutions that are in the area, and how they are able to come together. And what we see happening there is that the church itself is beginning to multiply and grow, but also grow in a way that is a healthy growth. We talked earlier about the mission of God. We talked about the word of God, and we talked about that being the truth, the foundation of what we ought to be thinking about for long term sustainability of the church. And we see that happening in Colombia. And I will actually be seeing in 3 weeks, I'll be in India because we're working. I will be there to see the launch of another regional hub like this. So I'm going to be there for the launch of this new one in South Asia. And I am just excited to see how these continue to multiply. There's another one that we're developing in Africa as well. So when I say we, it's not myself, it's a group of ministries that are coming together. So we see a lot of collaborative work involved in all of this too.
Well, thanks for sharing some of those stories. You know, it's always great to take the ideas and actually just present how this is playing out on the ground. I would love to circle back to our previous conversation for just a moment. You know, talking about the transformation that is needed in the hearts of students and those being trained. We have students that have a head full of knowledge, but a heart that's empty. And on the other hand, we've got churches throughout the global south that are filled with pastors who have a heart, but without the knowledge of the word of God that is healthy for a church to grow in the right way. How can we bridge the gap there? How can theological institutions equip students not just with head knowledge but a heart knowledge? I don't know if you have any good examples of how that's appropriate, and how can we then also reach the pastors who do have the heart for it but don't have the knowledge, and equip them in a way that's healthy and appropriate and helpful?
Do we have time for another podcast, Jason?
Perhaps we do. Perhaps we need to.
Some people use the word mentor, disciple maker, things along those lines. I use the word coach, and I speak of how is it that we can begin to coach and help people with their crafts. So I talk about coach, craft, and continuity. So by coaching, I mean to say it has to be really intentional, Jason. This doesn't just happen. And so, for instance, a young person that has the heart but doesn't have the knowledge, who is available, who is willing to coach that person, not just in the biblical truth and in spiritual character development, but in their craft. You see, a lot of younger people, they are so gifted, they have so much to offer the church locally, but I'm not sure if we're doing enough to help them develop their gifts and their crafts. And I use the word craft very intentionally. I mean, you have ministries that you work on. I have ministries that I'm involved with. We also always are looking at how do we refine our craft, right? How do we get better at what we're doing for the sake of God and for his glory? And I think that craft principle with younger people, how do we come alongside of them and help them develop those gifts and those talents in the word and in truth, but also the sense of continuity. How do we teach them that they are to pass it on? That's a very biblical principle. Because if you look at Paul and Timothy and others, even throughout the Old Testament, they were always looking at how do we pass this on to the next generation. So I think that we need to, one thing that I find is missing is that last element. Is helping people understand that this is not just about you. My wife often says, "You know what? It may not be your blessing, but it may be somebody else's blessing, you know? And it's not always about you." And so I think that how do we help people realize whether they're a teacher or professor at a school, whether they're a young person that has maybe the heart but maybe doesn't have the head knowledge, help them to realize that they have a responsibility to pass it on to others, a sense of continuity. And I think that if we can begin to communicate some of that, that'll begin to reframe the reason for which they're doing what they're doing.
And for those who are pastors, but they don't have access to theological education for whatever reason, where maybe it's finance or it's distance, or how can we better bridge that gap?
There are hundreds and maybe even thousands of training programs out there, and it's growing. There are online courses, there are online seminars, there are all sorts of things that pastors that don't have access to training can have an access to. The challenge with that for me is that I want to be very careful that we don't simply talk about content and information, but character development as well. If you look at Jesus in Matthew 28, when he gave the Great Commission, it wasn't just about content. He said, "Keep my commandments," and by that he meant not just know them, but live them out, observe them. And I think that's part of the Great Commission that sometimes maybe we don't think about enough. So for me, if anyone there's anyone listening to this podcast and they don't have access to training and they want some access to training, have them get in touch with us. And there are all sorts of training programs, materials out there that we can give them access to. Again, ISET has a lot of associate members and members of ISET that are involved in the more non-formal training space. So there's not a lack of resources. It's a matter of having the right resource and the right way of developing the character along the way.
You know, as you were sharing about character, I feels like I'm having throwbacks to my seminary days. But for one exam that we did for biblical studies, Professor Dr. Pereira, if you're listening, shout out to you. But he said to us, "Okay, I'm going to tell you what one of the questions for the exam is going to be." He said, "I want you to memorize the 10 Commandments." And we're like, "Oh, fantastic." And he said, "The challenge is actually a character test because the challenge is you're going to have a Bible available to you on your desk. So, and I won't know the difference." He said, "You can memorize it and you could write it word for word." That was the challenge, or you could copy it straight out. And actually, I won't know whether I'm giving you the right marks or not. You know, it's actually a test of character. And I was challenged by it. I was like, wow, okay, that's a worthy cause. And I remember arriving that day for the exam, and I went up to a group of people and said, "Hey, did you memorize the 10 Commandments?" And the one guy said to me, "Nah, I'm just going to copy it." And I said, but the challenge is it's a test of character. That's exactly what he said to us. He said, "I don't care." And I couldn't believe it as a, you know, someone training to become a pastor and go into a local church, and he was unwilling to allow that to be a formation moment for him. And that's essentially what I hear you saying is that's what we need. It's not just the head knowledge, but the heart knowledge. And
Absolutely.
so I want to shift. I want us to talk about ISET. Could you take a moment? A large part of our conversation has actually been bouncing off I know what you do through ISET. And so I want to honor that. And so could you take a moment to describe what ISET is for those who may have never heard of it?
Sure. The way I describe ISET is ISET is a global community that's concerned about quality in training and connecting the trainers. It's about quality and training and connecting the trainers. And altogether, if you look at all the ministries that are connected to ISET, all the training ministries, including Bible colleges, seminaries, non-formal training programs, and so on, all the members of ISET globally, we probably touch just over 300,000 students around the world. So it's a large global footprint through our constituents. And what ISET has been doing over the last 40 plus years is to help people come together and have conversations and community and explore collaborative ways of working together to improve quality in education and connections within training and theological education. I use the word theological education rather broadly, as you've already picked up, during this. But it's a great ministry. I mean, I've been doing this since the fall of 2019, and the Lord just continues to expand what we're doing. And I really do. You've probably picked it up already, but I really do believe there's a vital role to play in training and education to play in helping the church just be strengthened for its mission. And I constantly talk about that. And so my ministry space, my global ministry space right now has been in that area of how do we know what good quality is in training and how do we connect the trainers.
So could you unpack for us how you actually go about doing that? Most of the people that are listening to this are familiar with Lausanne and are comfortable in that kind of space, but practically, how do you bring people together? How do you train the trainers?
So we bring people together through global events. We've had 18 global gatherings over 40 years. The last one was in Izmir, Turkey. We had 500 plus people there from 80 countries, all theological education trainers. We have our next event coming up in March of 2025. The theme for that gathering is Next for Theological Education. What is next for theological education? And so what we're actually doing is we are creating, and I've been working some with some other folks from Lausanne as well on this. We're trying to think of ways that we could begin to work closer together for the sake of the church and mission through education and training and what's ISET's role in that. But one of the things we're doing for the next global event is we will be creating what's called ISET impact teams. They're very similar to the collaborative action teams that Lausanne is putting together, has been putting together. But these ISET impact teams will be communities of practice that revolve around a common area, an area of affinity, an area of connection. So, for instance, we talked about women a little while ago. We talked about orality, diaspora. So, how do we bring people globally together in smaller groups to talk about these topics and how are they relevant within theological education and training and how do we begin to elevate and embody them within theological education and training. And what we hope to do is we've got a coordinator for ISET for this now, and so we hope that these global smaller impact teams will work closely with theological education, with the church, with Lausanne even, and be asking questions about what are some of the gaps that need to be filled in theological education? And how can these smaller impact teams work towards filling in those gaps?
Wow, I love the vision for that. For those who are listening who might be interested in joining your gathering in March 2025, is it Dubai? Am I correct?
It is currently scheduled to be in Dubai. Yes, correct.
How can they sign up to attend? Is that possible? Or if they're interested in joining an impact team, what are some ways that they can get connected?
Yeah, the impact teams, we will have over time, we'll have likely dozens of them. There's so many topics as we have begun to share this vision about ISET impact teams. We're having a lot of people come on board and say, "Can I have an impact team in this area?" And we're like, "Sure." I mean, it's more of a ground up than a top down approach. ISET does not want to dictate what the topics all and the voices need to be. We need to hear from others and say that are more involved, even in theological education than I am, and having them speak into the impact teams. But our webpage is iset.info, ICETE.info. And if they go to that page, the first page will take them to the event in Dubai, and they could begin to see a little bit of a write up about what the event will take, what it will be about, the event in Dubai in March of 2025. They can get involved in that way. And they could also send emails out to me if they'd like. My email is michael.ortiz@iset.info, and I can get them connected up with those who can tell them more about the impact teams.
Awesome. Any other, I mean, you strike me as someone who has a lot of vision. So I don't want to limit your vision to the impact teams, but I would love to hear what are your hopes and your visions for the future of ISET? Do you have anything that you would like to share with our audience?
What I hope to see is that ISET will be celebrating its 50th year in 2030. And so we're going to have our big event in 2025. We're rolling out these ISET impact teams. We will likely have smaller clusters of gatherings worldwide between now and 2030 and begin to build up to that event. I imagine communities of practice, these impact teams, intentionally not just reflecting on, but making an impact on the way that theological education is done into the next number of years. And I look forward to seeing, maybe even by 2030, just a massive global celebration of how we have actually done something about theological. We've been talking about theological education today, but imagine a global celebration 5 years from now where we have these impact teams and even Lasan and others coming together and saying, let me tell you the stories of how the church is now strengthened for mission because theological education is not the same as it was back in 2024. And that's what I hope to see us do over the next number of years.
And that's such a beautiful vision for not only theological education, but the global church as well. I mean, Lausanne is also celebrating their 50th anniversary now at the Lausanne Incheon Congress. And so, yeah, I mean, it feels almost like we're running alongside each other in terms of the global church and mission. Are there any specific resources that you'd like to point people to that we can include in the show notes?
Again, if you go to our webpage, there is a section there that there's a tab there for resources, and they could click on that. And as they do so, there are some resources listed on there, including what we call ISET Academy. ISET Academy is an online training platform for trainers. So our end users, our target is not so much a student in a classroom, but a teacher or administrator or a leader of a program. And we have a wide range of courses that have been developed by experts in their fields to help educators. And then also there's ISET consulting on there. And then also they can go down to our constituency page and see all the different ministries are connected to ISET. And they might find something there that's useful as well.
Thank you. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes. Any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience?
I am hopeful. I'm encouraged by what the Lord has been doing in the world today, not just with the church and church growth, but I am excited to see what the Lord will do in the years to come in helping us to develop programs that are fit for purpose, fit for their context, addressing current realities, helping the church be long looking, as I call it, long looking, understanding what's ahead of it, and preparing leaders that are prepared and fit for that too. I think that as we look at our future leaders, we need to be looking at our programs in a way that is most fit for what they're looking for. There are areas of collaboration, areas of quality assurance that we can continue to build on for all that.
Definitely a lot of work to do, but I truly appreciate what you're doing for the global church and for taking the time to share your thoughts and your experiences with myself and the audience. I personally have found this a very rich conversation, and I'm going to be taking some of these to my heart and even maybe to my church, you know? So thank you, Dr. Ortiz, for your time. Truly appreciate you.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate you and I appreciate what you guys are doing through these podcasts. And again, just thank you for the privilege to be on here with you. I really do appreciate your investment in this as well.